So here with Joe Hoyt of the Dallas Morning News to talk SMU football. Sir, appreciate your time.
Of course, Mike. Always good to talk with you.
How's your offseason been going?
It's been good. Good. A lot of baseball in the offseason. And then obviously just trying to keep track of a lot of transfers, a lot of movement in today's news, a lot of realignment stuff too. So I guess we're going to have to get back on that train. But yeah, it's been good.
It was mostly a joke because I know you don't get an off season. You know, you go from one season to the next. But to talk about SMU football, you know, I think the big news over the off season, obviously, Sonny Dykes going to TCU, Rhett Lashley comes in. From your standpoint, what are your kind of initial reads or reactions on Coach Lashley and the staff he's put together?
Yeah, I think it's probably the first time in history that it's head coach was announced before the other coach actually was gone. So I think that was interesting. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of familiarity with Rhett Lashley. And I think anytime a coach goes from, you know, to their first head coaching role, it's kind of a, hey, let's see how this ship kind of runs. You know, let's kind of get a familiarity for it and see how it goes. And I think in spring, a big thing that Rhett Lashley had to do was make sure that he was able to retain players and not let them hit the transfer portal. And I think that was his biggest challenge. And to his credit and to the staff's credit, they did a good job at that. Obviously, they lost Ulysses Bentley couple weeks into spring practice. He's now at Ole Miss. That's a huge loss, you know, but then they were able to bring in another guy like Kamar Wheaton, who's now enrolled, and we'll see him come summer, which in a couple weeks. But I think that was kind of the big challenge. And I think there's still, in regards to the Rhett Lashley head coaching experience, a lot of unknown. Anytime there's a new first-time head coach, obviously that comes with it. And I think that's going to be one of the storylines heading this summer and into the initial first few weeks of fall.
You know, from somebody who watched some spring practices and was around the team, I think from the outside, everybody just assumes this SMU team is going to look the exact same, right? That Rhett Lashley's just coming in and he's going to run the same offense, same defense. You know, from what you've seen, are there going to be some differences in kind of the philosophy and the schemes that are being ran?
Yeah, I think, you know, from a similar standpoint, I think if you go back a couple of years to when he was an OC at SMU, you know, I think that kind of high-powered offense, obviously that's something Sonny Dykes like to do as well. But I think there were some unique nuances and some differences. I think the tempo was definitely a little bit picked up under Rhett Lashley, and I think you're going to see SMU go back to that a little bit. You know, their receiver depth is probably about 10 deep. So you're going to see a lot of cycling there. And I think defensively, under new defensive coordinator Scott Simons, you're going to see some defensive switches as well. I think one thing that they kind of strayed away from last year a little bit, and obviously was the one and only year of Jim Leavitt, but was a little bit, you know, they weren't as blitz happy. You know, it was kind of, you know, it was very man on an island on the outside. And to be honest, that kind of generated some high passing offense against them. I think that this year they're going to be a little bit more toolsy when it comes to their blitz packages. I'd expect some guys, you know, I think, you know, you might see Brian Massey, who was a returner, all conference returner last year. I think in a more safety blitz role, he might come downhill. I'm really curious to see how Cameron Farrar, you know, former Skyline guy who went to Oklahoma State, is now transferred in. I think he could be a really big asset in a blitz package. I'm just curious to see kind of what Scott Simons does on defense, and I think that's where you might see the most difference.
Yeah, I think that was an excellent hire by Coach Lashley, bringing him in. You kind of hit on the transfer portal and the amount of success SMU's had, and that's not new, right? Sonny Dykes had a lot of success in the transfer portal. Just being in the city of Dallas, and there's just so much talent here, and a lot of it goes elsewhere. And you know, people want to, you know, kind of a restart, get a new lease on life, and come back home. Like, how important is that for SMU football? Because it seems like when people talk about the transfer portal, it tends to be in a negative light. But for a team like SMU, it seems to be a very positive, you know, point of their program.
Yeah, you know, I think the saying always with recruiting is kind of that's the lifeblood of your program, right? Well, I think the transfer portal is the lifeblood of SMU's program. It's funny because, you know, they've had a couple of decommitments recently, and I was kind of looking at their recruiting. And if you kind of talk to SMU fans, a common thing they'll tell you anytime someone leaves is, okay, we'll see them in 2 to 3 years. And it's just kind of the mentality now. It's just, hey, you know, it's you recruit players, you have them on official visits, not for, you know, for their freshman and sophomore seasons, but for when they hit the transfer portal and kind of are looking for options. It's kind of a 4-year recruiting experience rather than a 1 year and then hope for the best, you know, for you to stay. So I think it's a huge asset for them. Obviously they got, obviously they got a lot of guys from Texas that come in this year, you know, a lot of guys from DFW that are coming back. Kamar Wheaton, you know, is obviously the big X factor. If he can be what he was in high school and what many thought he could be at Alabama, and then he could be obviously one of the conference's best running backs here, you know. And so there's there's a lot to alike when it comes to SMU strategy in the transfer portal, and I think it's their best strategy.
I find it ironic, right? Like SMU football was kind of killed, because of paying players and all that kind of stuff. And now with NIL, you can kind of lean into that. I've seen some graphics with like the Thunderbird and all that kind of stuff. Like, just for the city of Dallas, how nice and important is it to have SMU as like in the forefront of college football and like a real player in college football? Like, have you seen the city kind of gravitate more towards that than maybe, 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, I don't think it's an accident that one of the first people introduced at Rhett Lashley's introduction was not him, but was Eric Johnson, the mayor of Dallas. And I think that he, obviously, that there's, with the Triple D and all that stuff, there's a connection there. And I think the city of Dallas wants SMU to be kind of on the uprise again. And I think obviously SMU would love to partner with the city of Dallas and kind of, showcase what kind of business options there are. They have their Life After Ball program. They have a really affluent alumni base. And I think that those are things that they can definitely sell in regards to the name, image, and likeness. They do have a grassroots collective that is definitely paying, a lot of players currently on the roster with, smaller deals, obviously not the grand scale, 7-figure deals that we're talking about with other places. But I think that's somewhere that SMU fans hope to get to eventually. They're not there yet. But, in regards to the city of Dallas and just kind of the connection there, I think the city of Dallas is growing, and I think SMU is kind of hoping that they can grow with it.
Just to kind of touch on that a little bit more, like with Houston leaving and Cincinnati leaving and the new American kind of being, ripe for the picking, for lack of a better phrase, like how much of an advantage does Dallas and SMU have with that alumni base that you talked about? I guess, what is the ceiling for them and the new look American?
Yeah, I mean, I think that SMU fans would tell you that it's to be the perennial contender, to be the champion. Hopefully, SMU fans are hoping that the moment those schools leave, even the last year with them, that they can contend for American Conference titles. I think if you look at where the college football playoffs going, obviously, we'll have to see what happens with realignment and potential mega conferences that could be coming. But in regards to the CFP possibly expanding in the future, obviously there's going to be a group of 5 component to that. And how do you be that group of 5 representative? Well, you dominate in the group of 5. I think SMU sees a field of teams where they, on the football field, think they could dominate. And they could be the way that Cincinnati was the last couple of years, the way that UCF used to be, the way that Houston was. I think that they see themselves as that potential next step. And obviously it has to get done on the field, though, which is it brings a lot of intrigue to the first couple weeks, couple months of the Rhett Lashley experience.
To talk about this team a little bit before we let you go, like, I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what do you consider the strength of the offense? Is it that wide receiver core with just how much they've added, how much they have coming back?
I'd say the wide receiver core, especially when you kind of look at the veterans that are coming in. I think Bo Corrales is a very intriguing name. I think he's a big body guy. I think one thing that Rob Likens and Rhett Lashley kind of want to do is really utilize the back shoulder throw and kind of the more possession kind of base routes on the outside. And I think that, having a 6'3" guy like that, who's done it at University of North Carolina, is an asset. I think their running back room has also the potential to be really, really good. I mean, if you look at Trey Siggers, he was everything they asked for and more last year. Very dependable. And I think that's a guy that, if you talk about floors versus ceilings in regards to potential, he brings a lot of high floor to the entire group. TJ McDaniel is a guy that, broke his leg, hasn't played in a long time, took an alternate recovery route and is now practicing again. I mean, what can you get out of him? Brandon Epton's a guy they like. Tyler Levine's back as well. And then obviously Kamar Wheaton. I think the big question offensively is their offensive line group. A lot of questions there. New, obviously, staff coming in. They lost some stalwarts there. They brought some transfers in that have a chance to compete. I think that is the big unknown, and I think that's the big catalyst when it comes to whether their offense will go or not. And then obviously quarterback. You have a guy that broke school records last year, and then you have an All-American recruit that was recruited by the new head coach, and that's something that is going to have to be figured out in fall camp.
Yeah, we've had this conversation kind of like off record before and stuff. Like, how much do you expect to see Preston Stone? Because I'm a jaded, cynical person. I think anybody who knows me at all knows that about me. And I guess I looked at the Tanner Mordecai, Preston Stone kind of spring battle as a way to keep Preston Stone around. Like, do you think that he gets some packages or gets some looks, or Rhett like really gives him some drives and meaningful games early on in the season to kind of prove why he stuck around at SMU.
I think that cynicism is very valid in this case, especially when you consider that the previous head coach, only went 40 miles west. And then they have some quarterback questions as well. I think hypothetically, if a quarterback was named in spring, which obviously no coach would do, I mean, that puts at risk the potential of losing one of those guys. So obviously everyone wants to play, and these are two guys that want to play. I almost feel every time I talk about the quarterbacks, I kind of almost feel like it's almost a little bit of disrespect to Tanner Mordecai, because he did so well last year. Obviously had a couple of moments, a couple of hiccups where it's like, decision making, probably shouldn't have done it, but he broke school records for a reason. He was fantastic, all things considered, last season. But it's also, you got to give credit to the player Preston Stone is. This is a guy that turned down Alabama, that turned down Texas, that turned down multiple other schools to stay home at SMU and to be a superstar here. I mean, his expectations and the expectations for those around him are high. So obviously he wants to play as well. I'm curious to see where it goes. I think it is a legitimate competition, which, hey, the old saying is, having two quarterbacks isn't good. You want one good one. But I'm fascinated to see where it actually goes and to see how it plays out. The possibility of them mixing and matching early on in the season, I don't think is a crazy idea, for that reason that you said.
Yeah, I wonder, especially because the schedule lines up, at least on paper, to where, you should win those couple games. I wonder if Preston Stone's given like the third series or something like that on a couple of those games. To flip over the defensive side, when I was there doing magazine stuff, I talked to Jimmy Phillips, and he was very candid about, like, when you think of SMU football, you think of the offense, and we need to change that. What do you see from the defense in terms of improvements in 2022, beyond just like Coach Simons and what he brings?
Yeah, I think, we talked about how deep the receivers are. I think actually the best position group on this SMU team might be its defensive line. I think Devere Levelston is a first-team all-conference guy, a potential NFL guy. I think Elijah Chapman is another potential NFL interior defensive lineman. Turner Cox, who's coming off shoulder surgery, was fantastic on the edge last year. I think he might slide in a little bit more, maybe play a little bit more, kind of a power look there. And I think, that they have, if you kind of go back to Scott Simons' tenure, previously, they got after the quarterback. And I think that they're going to want to do that, obviously, this year, too. I think their linebacking core's, got a lot of options. Shannon Reed transferred in from Illinois State. He's a guy with a lot of experience. I think that there's a lot of talent there with Jimmy Phillips, like you mentioned. I think corner is the big question again. And ideally, when you start two freshmen on corners, including one guy who had literally never played corner in Bryce McMorris until he played corner in Division I college football, I think the whole intention with that is there's going to be growing pains, but there's the potential for big rewards. I think that they're hoping for a jump from year one to year two for those guys. And they obviously have the talent. Jahari Rogers is extremely talented, was a guy at Florida, had the biggest hit in the spring game, absolutely decked a guy. And that's something that, is not necessarily you'd think in his toolbox, if you kind of look at, what kind of tools he has. So I think that that's the big, catalyst is how the secondary shows up. But I think everywhere else, they got a lot of talent.
All right, to put you on the spot before we go, if I set that over and under at 8 wins, which way are you heading on that one?
I think if you said 8.5, it would have hurt me more. I'm going to go over. I think that, but that, that's also contingent on some big wins there. Clearly, I think if you're going to go over 8, you got to beat TCU, which will obviously be a fun game when that comes. Maybe steal a road game against Maryland. I think, their whole goal is to be, the leader of the American Conference, not only in the future, but this year. And to do that, you're going to have a quality first year from the first-time head coach, Rhett Lashley. And you're going to have, quarterback play that can really carry this team with a lot of weapons. So I'm going to go over for optimistic standpoint. That obviously could change by the time my final predictions come in fall. So I'm kind of hedging my bet there a little bit, but yeah, I think that ideally they'd like to go over.
Yeah, I found the toughest part of the magazine was coming up with records and stuff like that in May. It's like, how do you even like predict that kind of stuff? Like on a scale of 1 to like how, in terms of like games you've covered so far on the SMU beat, is the 2022 Battle of the Iron Skillet going to be the top? I mean, how excited, how fun do you think that atmosphere is going to be there at Ford Stadium?
So here's the irony: is I have a buddy of mine I grew up with who didn't go to a college football school, which means he's getting married, and he decided to have a wedding in the fall as a groomsman. So I think that is going to have the most intrigue of any college football game aside from a college football playoff game that I've ever covered. I think the idea of a head coach going across the street to a rival is something that doesn't happen, and I think obviously there's reasons for it, but it's something that doesn't happen very often. And I think that it just brings a whole new level of excitement to that game, a game that if you go back a year ago, resulted in a flag planting, resulted in, a coach getting knocked over who one coach thought it was blame the other team and said they hit him. And then there was Zap Ruder film, I swear, from that incident. So there was already going to be so much intrigue whether or not Sonny Dykes stayed or left, or even left for another school. And the fact that it's, a coach that built up a program and went to another one across the street makes it so interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited. College football can kind of get buried in DFW just because there's just so many things happening, so many teams, so many different sports going on. But I think this TCU SMU rivalry is going to be really great for the area. And I think I could make an argument that both schools are better off, today than they were, this time last year, because I think, Rhett's going to be there for a little bit. So appreciate you coming on. And we'll see you throughout the year, probably at that SMU TCU game.
Of course. Sounds good, Mike.